when a head of state is assassinated inside his own palace,
when the perpetrators aren't rebels or terrorists, but his closest allies,
and when an entire government is replaced within hours, without a declaration of war, without a single word spoken to the world. This is no longer a military operation. This is a geopolitical game crafted with blood, with shadows, and with the deadly silence of a superpower. This is the untold story of Storm-333, the Soviet assassination operation carried out at the heart of Kabul, one winter night in 1979. The history of Afghanistan and the world took a turn from which it would never return.
December 1979. The sky over Kabul is misty and deadly. The people of the capital still move along the dusty streets, completely unaware. At this very moment, a plot to assassinate the head of state is underway, not by an external enemy, but by his closest ally, the Soviet Union. At Bagram Military Airport, each IL-76 of the Soviet Air Force continuously lands, bringing in special forces units with no insignia, no identification, no documents. They are phantoms, trained to kill without leaving a trace. Their target is not to fight in the trenches, but to infiltrate the presidential palace, to eliminate one man, a name that had become an obsession inside the Kremlin's meeting rooms, Hafizullah Amin.
Time rewinds to April 1978. Afghanistan, then a country following an independent modernization model led by President Daoud, fell into the hands of a coup launched by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. The uprising, known as the Sour Revolution, took place in just a few days but was bloody. President Daoud and nearly his entire family were executed right inside the palace. The PDPA, a communist party with close ties to the Soviet Union, came to power, with Nur Muhammad Taraki holding the position of chairman. But the PDPA itself was already deeply divided, like a ticking time bomb. Even before taking power, the party had been split into two hostile factions, Khalq and Parcham, differing not only in policy but also in social identity. Khalq, led by Taraki and Amin, gathered people of rural origin, often Pashtun, with a tendency toward radical revolution and belief in immediate change. Parcham, led by Babrak Karmal, was largely made up of the urban middle class, softer in approach, inclined toward gradual reform, and respectful of tribal structure and traditional society. Although initially cooperating to seize power within just a few months, Khalq quickly purged Parcham from within the government. The split in the Afghan Communist Party was inevitable, because it was not simply a matter of ideological disagreement, but a full-scale confrontation between two cultural classes. Beneath the surface of unity, a brutal power struggle was taking place. Taraki, although the head of state, was gradually manipulated by his own deputy, Hafizullah Amin. At that time, Amin held the position of Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior, controlling all security forces and intelligence agencies. It was Amin who held the real power in the government, while Taraki became a gradually sidelined figurehead. In September 1979, Taraki was assassinated, a death with no announcement, no funeral, no confirmation, but everyone knew it was Amin who had ordered the killing. After taking absolute power, Hafizullah Amin implemented a series of coercive social reform policies, all without regard for the cultural realities of the Afghan people. Thousands of landlords and tribal leaders were arrested and executed in people's courts. Women were forced to attend school and work, despite fierce opposition from conservative communities. The tribal system and religious traditions, which had been the social fabric holding Afghan society together, were labeled reactionary and targeted for destruction. The result was an extremely fierce backlash. Instead of modernizing, Amin turned the entire country against the government, even those who had once been neutral. Across Afghanistan, armed uprisings erupted, not only from religious groups but also from ethnic minorities and formerly neutral veterans. The military lost discipline. Many units became paralyzed. In Moscow, the chaos in Afghanistan sent the Soviet leadership into a state of panic.
They were not only losing a strategic ally, but also facing the possibility of seeing a communist government they had supported being overthrown by the people. Worse still, Hafizullah Amin had a history of studying in the U.S., spoke fluent English, had spent time living at Columbia University, and had children studying there. These details made the Kremlin suspicious that Amin might be a double agent or even an American spy operating on a long-term plan. Although there was no clear evidence, Soviet intelligence officials issued a warning. If Amin remained in power, Afghanistan would fall into Western hands.
On December 12, 1979, the Soviet Politburo held a secret meeting and made the decision to invade Afghanistan. The operation would include deploying more than 100,000 troops into Afghanistan, assassinating President Amin as quickly as possible, installing a new government with Babrak Karmal as leader, protected by the Soviet Red Army. The assassination mission was assigned to the Alpha and Vympel Special Forces units of the KGB under the codename Storm-333. In the final days of December, Kabul was gradually encircled. Soviet troops, under the label of military advisors, quietly occupied strategic positions. The radio station, the General Staff headquarters, military and civilian airports, roads leading to the suburbs. Civilians whispered to each other about something happening, but no one knew for sure. There was only an eerie silence, the silence before a violent storm. As darkness fell over Kabul on the night of December 27, 1979, most people still believed it was a quiet winter night. But deep inside the Bagram military base, irreversible decisions had been signed. A group of Soviet Special Forces officers from the Alpha and Vympel units were assembled and received a secret order from the KGB command. The time has come. Targets, Tajbeg Palace. Eliminate Subject 333. Leave no trace. No failure. The air in the tactical room was thick. Every soldier understood. Tonight was not a drill. It was a deadly mission, the assassination of an internationally recognized head of state, right in the capital of a sovereign nation. The Tajbeg Palace was not an easy building to infiltrate. Built during the time of King Amanullah, this residence stood on high ground overlooking Kabul, surrounded by steep hills, thick stone walls, and sparse pine forests. Since taking power, Amin had turned it into a true fortress. Inside the palace, security was maximized. Amin lived with his wife, children, and close relatives. Nearly 200 Revolutionary Guards, mostly Pashtuns from his home region, stood watch day and night. Heavy machine guns were stationed at the entrances. The windows had steel mesh. There was even an emergency escape tunnel leading to an evacuation bunker. Amin once said to his close advisor, "They may come from the sky, from the ground, but I will be the last one to die here." He did not expect that those who would come were the very ones who had once called him comrade. The assault plan was meticulously designed, divided into 3 prongs. Frontal assault. An Alpha Special Forces team would attack through the main gate with direct fire, coordinated with BRDM and BTR armored vehicles. Flanking strike. The Vympel team would climb the western wall using ropes, infiltrating from the upper floors, where Amin's office and private quarters were located. Escape lock. GRU units would cut off all exits to the south and east, taking control of the tunnels to ensure no one escaped. Firepower was supported by flamethrowers, AGS-17 grenade launchers, and smoke grenades. The Special Forces wore heavy body armor, armed with AKS-74U submachine guns, compact and suited for close quarters combat. At around 7:30 p.m., the battle began. A loud explosion tore through the main gate, signaling the start of the most intense raid ever to take place in downtown Kabul. The entire front of the Tajbeg Palace was engulfed in smoke and fire. The Afghan guards immediately returned fire, unloading bullets from bunkers and balconies. Several Soviet soldiers were hit in the first volley, falling without a chance to retaliate. But the overwhelming advantage in tactics and equipment had already decided the outcome. The commandos stormed the first floor, then the second. Grenades exploded deafeningly. Bayonet combat broke out in the pitch-dark hallways, where the two sides fired at such close range they could see each other's eyes. The battle lasted only about 40 to 45 minutes, but its intensity was described as a quake, a silent death match. When the commandos entered the master bedroom, Amin was no longer conscious. A few hours earlier, he had eaten lunch with his family, a meal prepared by a new chef. Afterward, he suddenly fell ill, vomiting, dizziness, convulsions. Doctors could not determine the cause. There is evidence that Amin had been poisoned beforehand, possibly with a mild nerve agent to incapacitate him before the commandos arrived. When the Vympel team found him, Amin was lying motionless in his private room. His wife was screaming. His son and nephew lay dead in the hallway. However, some Soviet documents state that he resisted, even managed to shoot and wound a commando before being executed on the spot. No trial, no interrogation. The death happened without words, no certificate, no funeral, no confirmed remains. When the Tajbeg Palace was taken, gunfire still echoed in a few outlying areas, but the core of Afghan power had been crushed. There was no command center. No one had the authority to replace Amin. The entire political system collapsed like a building whose foundation had been pulled out. At intersections, Soviet armored vehicles set up checkpoints. Afghan military compounds were surrounded, weapons confiscated, officers summoned one by one. Some commanders loyal to Amin were quietly eliminated with no records filed. While the smoke of battle had not yet cleared, another political drama began. From Eastern Europe, Babrak Karmal, who had been exiled by Amin, was flown back by military aircraft. He appeared on the national radio broadcast declaring, "A new government has been formed. Amin is a traitor. We will continue the true revolutionary path." No one mentioned the role of the Soviet Union. No one mentioned Amin's death. The entire country seemed suffocated under a thick veil of information, built from guns, tanks, and formulaic speeches. Operation Storm-333 ended after a few hours, a technically perfect victory for the KGB and the Soviet Army. But at that very moment, in the terrifying silence of Kabul after the battle, another war silently ignited. Pashtun tribal elders held secret meetings in rural areas. Islamic fighters began opening their weapons caches. And in the Panjshir Mountains, a commander named Ahmad Shah Massoud sent out a message: "We will not let foreigners decide our fate again." Storm-333 had completed its mission, but it did not kill a will, a fire rising from beneath, and it would burn fiercely through a bloody decade. December 28, 1979. While Hafizullah Amin's body had not yet been buried, a new face appeared on the national radio of Afghanistan. Babrak Karmal, former leader of the Parcham faction exiled by Amin, declared himself head of the new government, trusted by the entire party and the people. But in reality, he was not elected. He had no backing force inside the country. He returned by Soviet military aircraft, accompanied by dozens of security, technical, and propaganda advisors. There was no parliamentary session, no official declaration from the PDPA. The new government was installed with the speed of violence and the absolute silence of tightly controlled media. Babrak Karmal was called General Secretary, Chairman of the Revolutionary Council, and Prime Minister. But he held no real power. All government activities, from military, interior, propaganda to diplomacy, were controlled by a network of Soviet advisors. Soviet generals advised the Ministry of Defense. KGB personnel advised the Afghan General Security Directorate. Propaganda, press, and broadcasting units were rewritten in Soviet style under the supervision of Russian experts. Afghanistan became a dual government, an official native administration in name, but in reality, a bureaucracy entirely dependent on Moscow. Right after taking office, Karmal addressed the nation.
"We have come to end bloodshed, to reconcile factions, to bring the country back to the true revolutionary path."
But that promise quickly turned into widespread disappointment. The Kauk faction, the political force that once controlled the military, was purged, arrested, or eliminated.
Parcha members from abroad were recalled to hold key positions, but had no social base inside the country. The secret police continued arrest campaigns, this time targeting anyone suspected of questioning the Kabul-Moscow relationship. The result was not stability, but a simmering wave of civil resistance that spread from the capital to the provinces. To most Afghans, the killing of Amin and Karmal's succession was not an internal Communist Party transition, but a disguised foreign occupation. Islamic clerics from Herat, Kandahar, and Nangarhar declared the current government atheist, puppet, and must be destroyed. Pashtun tribal leaders from eastern regions convened, calling for a complete severance from the central government. In mountainous provinces, small armed groups began to organize spontaneously, armed with old weapons, smuggled AKs, or even just daggers and antique rifles. The concept of Islamic resistance was first voiced not by missionaries, but by former Afghan army veterans who now felt betrayed. In distant valleys, Panjshir, Nuristan, Kunar, guerrilla commanders began to rise. Ahmad Shah Massoud, a young Tajik engineer, built his first base in Panjshir. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, leader of Hezbollah Islami, mobilized former students from Kabul University. Burhanuddin Rabbani, an Islamic scholar, organized an ideological anti-communist network in the north. Other small groups, from monarchists to Orthodox Islamists, all shared one goal: expel the invaders and overthrow Karmal's government. Though not yet tightly connected, these Mujahideen groups gradually formed a decentralized armed resistance network capable of mobilizing society in rural areas. Within days after Storm-333, a wave of condemnation spread across the world. The United Nations convened an emergency session condemning the action as a violation of sovereignty and the right of self-determination of an independent nation. The US, UK, France, West Germany, Egypt, and China strongly denounced it. U.S. President Jimmy Carter announced a suspension of the Strategic Arms Reduction Process, SALT II Treaty, and issued an embargo on agricultural and technological exports to the Soviet Union. The 1980 Moscow Olympics faced an unprecedented wave of boycotts. Afghanistan, once just a small country on the map's edge, suddenly became the focal point of the Cold War, where superpowers were ready to wage proxy war with others' blood. By early 1980, the Soviet Union had nearly 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. They controlled the cities, airports, and main transportation routes. But outside the capital, everything slipped beyond their control. Soviet soldiers were constantly ambushed by Mujahideen groups using guerrilla tactics. Supply lines from the northern border were repeatedly sabotaged. In rural areas, anyone cooperating with the central government became an assassination target. Leaflets, cassette tapes, and sermons were spread in markets, mosques, weddings, calling for a holy war against foreign invaders. The Soviets began using air power, heavy artillery, and even incendiary weapons, napalm, cluster bombs, to hunt down insurgents, only further enraging the civilian population. In the midst of this spiral, Babrak Karmal gradually became a man caught between two grindstones. Outside, the people saw him as a puppet. Inside, even Soviet advisors distrusted him, considering him too weak. Within the PDPA, remnants of the Kauk faction still sought to sabotage him from within. Karmal frequently appeared on television, speaking about stability, reform, reconstruction, but no one believed him. Even his own generals only took orders from the Soviet officers accompanying them. His government existed, but only as a curtain to conceal a full-scale military occupation. By the end of 1980, one reality was clear. The Karmal government had no social foundation, no loyal army, no strong party, no trust from the people, no tribal base, no religious roots. The so-called socialist revolution was now just an empty shell, filled only with Soviet military presence and administrative control. But precisely because of that, it inadvertently created the worst enemy Moscow had ever faced. A nation with faith, with guns, and with an irreconcilable hatred for the invaders calling themselves comrades. Operation Storm-333 began as a quick, clean, and effective intervention. Within just a few hours, the Soviet Union had eliminated Hafizullah Amin, established a new government, and taken control of the capital, Kabul. But instead of bringing stability, it opened a new era of war that would last a decade. Because the Soviets didn't just kill a man, they killed the trust of an entire nation. From 1980 onward, Afghanistan was no longer a developing socialist republic. It became a battlefield of ideologies, religions, tribes, and superpowers. At first, the Soviet Red Army thought they only needed to maintain order for a few months, but the conflict spread with terrifying speed. The Mujahideen controlled most of the northern and eastern mountain regions. Roadways were constantly sabotaged, especially the Salong route linking Kabul to the Soviet Union. Airports, fuel depots, and military outposts all became targets of ambush, landmines, and surprise shelling. Every year, thousands of Soviet soldiers died, went missing, or were wounded. Troop morale collapsed. Some units began withdrawing from their posts on their own, avoiding combat. At home, the bodies of fallen soldiers were returned in sealed coffins. No public funerals, no names. A war that could not be called by its name. From late 1980, the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, began funneling money, weapons, and training to Mujahideen groups. The CIA partnered with Pakistan's ISI to set up training camps in Pakistan. Weapons, grenades, communications gear, even Stinger surface-to-air missiles were provided en masse. Radical Islamic groups from across the Middle East poured into Afghanistan in the name of jihad against communism. Afghanistan became the largest proxy battlefield of the Cold War. The Soviet Union now faced not just local rebels, but a resistance movement armed, financed, and strategically backed by the West. By 1986, under pressure both domestically and internationally, the Soviet Union was forced to replace Babrak Karmal. His successor was Mohammad Najibullah, a former intelligence chief said to be stronger and more pragmatic. But in truth, this was merely a desperate attempt to save face. Because when the central government couldn't control 80% of the territory, what did the name of its leader even mean? In February 1989, under international pressure and internal economic crisis, the Soviet Union officially withdrew all troops from Afghanistan. The war had lasted nearly 10 years, consumed hundreds of billions of rubles, cost over 15,000 Soviet lives, and left behind a shattered, divided, and heavily armed nation. They left in silence. No celebration, no glory, only a bitter retreat, and the precursor to the Soviet Union's own collapse 2 years later. After the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan did not return to peace. The Mujahideen, once allies in war, now turned on each other in a violent struggle for power. Najibullah's government lasted 3 more years, then fell in 1992. A massive power vacuum followed, bringing civil war, warlordism, and anarchy. From the ashes of the war, a new force emerged, the Taliban. They promised to restore order, implement Islamic law, and wipe out all remnants of the godless communist era. Operation Storm-333 began as a tactical decision to assassinate an uncontrollable leader, but Amin's death ended nothing. It unleashed a chain of consequences that could no longer be stopped. A 10-year war that destroyed Afghanistan, the rise of armed radical Islamic movements, America's indirect involvement laying the groundwork for al-Qaeda, and later the 9/11 attacks leading to 2 decades of American war in Afghanistan. Every link in this chain traces back to that December night in 1979, when Soviet special forces stormed the Tajbeg Palace, guns in hand, and a single order: eliminate the target at all costs. Afghanistan has never recovered. Since Storm-333, the country has not seen even 5 consecutive years of peace. It is the result of a single mistaken belief that history can be controlled through force. But history is not a puppet, and when a superpower believes it can reshape reality with blood, it will pay the price, not just in lives lost, but in the collapse of its own empire.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with others. See you in the next mission.